The Roman Empire built its dominance not just on discipline and numbers, but on pure innovation in warfare. Their engineers and soldiers created weapons that were terrifyingly effective for their time. Some were brutally simple, others were ahead of their century, but all of them helped Rome control the known world. Today, we'll look at the 10 most insane weapons that made the Roman military nearly unstoppable, and some of them will genuinely surprise you. Number 1. The Gladius. The Roman Gladius looks modest at first glance, yet it was built for a specific job, and it did that job frighteningly well. The army adopted the basic form from Celtiberian swords in Spain, and then tuned it for the way legions actually fought. The blade was short and double-edged with a strong point, which meant a soldier could thrust in the tight space behind a shield and still cut if a quick chop made more sense. Typical fighting blades measured roughly half a meter in length, with the whole sword around 60 to 70 centimeters, and usually under a kilo in weight. That size let a soldier keep the shield high, make a small step, and drive the point into exposed ribs or belly without overreaching. In close ranks, that economy of motion mattered more than flashy swings. Archaeology shows several main shapes across time. The early Hispaniensis had a slight waist to the blade. The Mainz type kept a broad profile and a pronounced tip. The later Pompey type straightened the edges and trimmed the point, which made mass production easier and handling very predictable. Museums hold examples of all three, and you can see how each variant favors firm thrusts from behind the scutum. The construction also tells a story. Many blades show piled or pattern-welded iron that creates a stiff diamond-like section with a reinforced tip. That geometry helps the point survive bone and shield strikes while still giving enough edge to open tendons or arms when a thrust is not on. Tactically, the Gladius was only 1/3 of a package. The Pilum disrupted shields and lines, the scutum protected the body, and created a moving wall, and the Gladius finished the job at arm's length. Writers from antiquity emphasized thrusting because a deep puncture in the torso is hard to treat and often fatal, while slashes can be messy but less decisive. Modern forensic work backs that logic, showing how penetrating wounds threaten vital organs quickly. Training matched the intent. Recruits drilled with heavy wooden practice swords and weighted shields to build endurance and to make the real weapon feel lively in the hand. In formation, they learned to keep the point forward, to strike under or around shield edges, and to recover fast so the man to the right could step in. Over the centuries, the army shifted toward the longer spatha, especially for cavalry, but the Gladius remained the backbone of infantry work through the high period of Roman expansion. Its power came from fit with doctrine. It was short enough to use in a crush, sharp enough to punish mistakes, and strong enough to push through the small targets that a shield wall exposes. When tens of thousands of trained soldiers moved as one, that simple sword turned discipline into an edge sharper than any ornament ever could. Number 2. The Pilum. The Roman Pilum was not just a spear thrown before a charge. It was a purpose-built tool designed to break an enemy line in a few heartbeats. A pilum had a wooden shaft and a long, slender iron shank with a hard point. Many versions used softer iron in the shank, so it bent on impact. That bend meant the weapon stuck in a shield and dragged it down. The enemy could not pull it out and could not throw it back. A shield pinned by a pilum became dead weight, so many warriors dropped their protection at the worst possible moment. Soldiers usually carried 1 or 2 pila on the march. Before closing in with the Gladius, a rank would launch a coordinated volley at about 20 to 30 meters. The timing mattered. They waited for the enemy to commit to the advance, then filled the front with heavy darts that ruined shields and frayed nerves. The second volley often hit men who were already trying to adjust their grip or step around a skewered shield. By the time the Romans closed the distance, the target line was full of gaps and hesitation. Design details varied across centuries and theaters. Some pila had a socket to fit over the shaft, while others had a tang that ran inside the wood. Both aimed to keep the head attached through the shock of impact. You will also see discussion of lead-weighted pila. The weight was not for show. It pushed momentum into the strike and made the bend more punishing. The point was pyramidal and tough, which helped it punch through leather, mail, and even thin plate. The real power of the Pilum was psychological as much as physical. A wall of spears coming in high and then falling like rain is hard to stand under. When every shield in the front rank is suddenly awkward, the clean formation that an enemy captain drilled for months starts to break. Men step sideways. They expose ribs. They look down. That tiny disruption is all a disciplined legion needs. The Romans built their whole opening sequence around that moment. First, the volley to force mistakes. Then the push with shields. Then the short stabbing work that finishes the fight. The Pilum was the switch that turned a moving crowd into a vulnerable target. And it did that with simple materials shaped by careful thought. Number 3. The Scorpion. Roman engineers built the Scorpion as a compact torsion engine that acted like a giant precision crossbow, and it earned a reputation as the legion's quiet killer. Instead of a bow, it used 2 bundles of twisted fibers that stored energy and snapped the throwing arms forward when the trigger released. That design gave the weapon a sharp, fast shot with a flat trajectory, which made it perfect for picking off officers, standard bearers, or anyone foolish enough to show a gap in the shield line. Writers from the period describe versions small enough for a few men to handle, and large enough to sit on ramparts, and reliefs show crude pieces on carts moving with the column. The hardware looked simple at a glance, but every detail mattered. The skeins worked best with animal sinew, or hair that held a tight twist. The slider bed had to be straight and smooth, and the bolt channel needed careful alignment, so the shot left cleanly. Crews kept the torsion bundles covered when wet weather rolled in, and they checked the binding regularly because small changes in moisture could shift power and throw off aim. A trained team could drop a bolt through a shield at effective field ranges and still punch with authority at greater distances from a wall or hill. In a siege, the Scorpion punished anyone who tried to work a ram or raise ladders. In the open, it served as counterfire against enemy archers, and as a way to break a cavalry approach before it hit the infantry. Ancient authors highlight how multiple Scorpions working together could rake a frontage and create pockets of fear that the line troops would immediately exploit. Modern reconstructions back up the idea that these engines delivered rapid, repeatable shots with lethal penetration when crews kept the skeins tuned. The Scorpion was not about spectacle. It was about control. It turned engineering into a steady heartbeat that shaped the fight minute by minute and opened windows for the Legion to close in and finish the job. Number 4. The Ballista. Think of the Ballista as Rome's long-range problem solver that turned careful math into raw impact on the field. It used torsion power from tightly twisted bundles of sinew to drive 2 rigid arms that launched a heavy bolt or a shaped stone. Engineers sized every part with ratios that balanced power and control, because a stiff frame without tuned skeins was just dead weight. Crews kept the bundles dry with covers, checked the twist before every shot, and tracked small changes in tension during the day, since heat and moisture could shift performance and pull a shot offline. A well-set ballista threw iron-headed bolts with a flat, fast path that could punch through shields and light defenses, while stone projectiles spread force across a wall face and shook timber joints loose. You would see them on city walls during sieges, and also rolled out with legions in the field, on carts built with wide axles for stability. Each piece had a team with a commander, wind readers, loaders, and men on the winch. They used simple sights, range markers, and a lifting wedge or screw to dial elevation. A quadrant scale or even chalk marks on the stock gave them repeatable settings, so they could walk rounds onto a gate or a dense knot of cavalry with steady corrections. The presence of several ballistae working together mattered as much as the raw power of one. They could rake an approach lane, picket officers, or set a rhythm that pinned an enemy while infantry closed in. Logistics were part of the weapon system too. Forgemen kept spare bolts and heads ready, carpenters swapped worn sliders, and leather workers maintained covers and lashings. The ballista earned trust because it was predictable when cared for, and that predictability shaped tactics. Commanders planned assaults around timed barrages to mask sappers or to clear ladders. In field battles, they used counter-battery fire against enemy engines and chased off archers who tried to dominate the mid-range. It was not just ancient artillery. It was a discipline tool that turned the space beyond the spear throw into Roman ground. Number 5. The Plumbata. Roman soldiers treated the Plumbata like a pocket ambush they could launch on command. It was a lead-weighted dart with a slim iron head, a short wooden shaft, and simple fletching that kept the flight stable. The weight sat close to the head and pulled the nose down in a clean arc, which helped the dart bite through leather and into mail when it landed. Most examples were compact and light by design, often well under 200 grams, so a trained thrower could send a small storm of them across a midfield gap without wasting energy. The late Roman manuals describe infantry carrying several inside the hollow of the shield, usually 5, so the weapon was always ready without cluttering a soldier's hands. That storage trick mattered during the moment before contact, when a coordinated toss could rattle the other side and open a path for the push. Archaeology backs up the paperwork. Finds from frontier forts and British towns match the shape described in the texts, with iron points, cast lead collars, and evidence for leather or feather veins. The dates line up with the late Empire, which fits the period when infantry tactics leaned harder on layered missile fire to control space before the shield lines met. Reconstructions show useful ranges that surprise people who expect only javelin distances. A good crew can throw past 50 meters with repeatable accuracy, and many tests report deeper hits at shorter ranges where the weight and point work together. The army also knew how to vary the pattern. Sources mention spiked versions meant to foul open ground, and writers in the Byzantine world keep the idea alive after the Western Empire fell. The effect in battle was more than wounds. A front rank that looks up as darts come down starts to lose shape. Men step back or break their stance to shield their faces. That small flex is exactly when a disciplined line surges and turns a meeting into a shove. The Plumbata earned its place because it made that moment happen often, with simple parts that any Legion workshop could cast and assemble quickly, and with handling drills that fit neatly into the daily routine of the rank and file. Number 6. The Onager. Think of the Onager as Rome's heavy hitter when a wall refused to listen. It was a one-armed torsion catapult that stored power in 2 tight bundles of twisted fibers, and then snapped a throwing arm up into a padded crossbeam. At the end of that arm sat a small sling, or a bowl that cradled a stone. When the crew pulled the trigger, the arm whipped skyward, the sling opened, and a block of rock sailed in a rising arc towards the target. The nickname fits the show. Ancient writers said the kick felt like a wild donkey, which is why the machine carried the animal's name. Crews respected that kick because recoil could toss the frame or injure anyone who stood too close to the bed. The Onager belonged to the later Roman toolkit, and it specialized in stone throwing. That role made sense during sieges, where a steady rain of heavy shot could crack a parapet, shatter timber bracing, and wear down a gate before sappers moved in. The engine did not match a ballista for pinpoint shots, but it did not need to. Its job was to pound an area and keep workers off the wall. Archaeology and tests with reconstructions suggest useful ranges that let a fortress batter the ground in front of its curtain, and let besiegers sit outside bow range, while still dropping rocks into towers. Ammunition was flexible. Smooth stones flew well. Shaped blocks hit harder. Crews sometimes packed pots with fire starters to scare defenders and clear battlements for a ladder rush. Everything about the Onager rewarded consistent setup and care. The torsion skeins worked best with sinew or hair that held a twist, so teams kept them covered from rain and checked tension during the day. A small change in moisture could steal power and throw a shot wide. The frame had to be stout and square. The slider bed needed to be smooth. The winch, powel, and trigger had to reset cleanly under load so the rate of fire stayed steady. A good team marked elevation on the stock and ranged landmarks outside the wall to build a rhythm. Once the angles were dialed in, they could walk shot after shot along a gate until braces failed, or they could lift the arm a little and start dropping stones into the courtyard to break formations. In the field, a few engines on carts could sit behind the infantry and arc stones into dense patches of enemy troops, or harass crews working their own machines. That is where the Onager's reputation for raw force mattered even more than precision. The thump of the arm, the crack of the sling, and the crash on impact took attention away from everything else and opened moments for the legions to move. Roman texts name officers who supervised artillery and describe how many hands a piece needed, which matches what practical builders find today. You needed muscle on the winch, a steady head on the sights, and someone to call wind and elevation. You also needed smiths to keep the bolts and fittings sound, carpenters to replace worn parts, and leather workers to look after covers and padding. That support turned a dangerous contraption into a reliable tool. Over time, traction and counterweight trebuchets took over because they were simpler to feed and scale. Yet, the Onager left its mark on the craft. It proved that a torsion machine could turn stored twist into a controlled arc, and it taught commanders how to fold timed barrages into a plan. The result was not flashy. It was disciplined power, aimed at breaking nerve and masonry until a gap appeared and the real work could begin. Number 7. The Corvus. The Corvus was a boarding bridge that let Rome fight a sea battle like it was on land, which played straight into legionary strengths. Picture a heavy timber plank with guardrails, hung from a stout vertical post near the bow of a warship. At the far end sat an iron spike shaped like a beak. The crew raised the bridge with a winch while the helmsman lined up on an enemy deck. When the moment felt right, they released the tackle and let the bridge drop. The spike punched through planking and locked the two hulls together. That single move erased the advantage of faster or more agile opponents and turned the fight into a brawl, where Roman marines and soldiers knew exactly what to do. Contemporary accounts placed its debut in the First Punic War, when Rome was still new to naval combat against Carthage. The idea was simple. If you cannot outsail a veteran fleet, you force them to stand and trade blades. The device did not need to be beautiful. It needed to be reliable, heavy, and easy to reset for the next target. Crews drilled the approach until it felt like a practiced charge. Rowers held the rhythm, the bow team watched the swell, and the officer on the post called the drop. Once the beak bit, shield men crossed first to create a small wall, and the rest followed with short swords and spears. Tactically, the Corvus created chain reactions. One captured deck gave a stable firing point for missiles onto the next ship. Captains used that to break tight enemy formations. There were limits, and Roman commanders learned them the hard way. The bridge added high weight at the bow and made a ship more awkward in rough water. In heavy seas, the tall post caught wind, and the extra mass encouraged a dangerous roll. That trade-off likely explains why the Navy scaled back the device once crews and shipwrights gained confidence and better tactics. Even with those drawbacks, the Corvus changed the early balance of power because it rewired what a naval fight meant. It turned speed into a trap because charging in meant offering your deck to a falling iron spike and a wave of infantry. It also changed training and logistics. Smiths forged spare beaks. Carpenters kept fresh pins and rails ready. Marines learned to cross in tight files and hold a wedge around the hinge point so the bridge stayed secure under feet and steel. The larger lesson sits behind the wood and iron. Rome did not try to outrun a rival's talent. It redesigned the fight so that discipline and close combat mattered most. The Corvus was a piece of hardware, but it was also a mindset, and that mindset won battles before the oars cooled. Number 8. The Caltrop. The Romans knew that not every battle was won with big engines and loud shocks, so they kept a quiet tool that punished speed and carelessness. The Caltrop was a simple iron object with 4 spikes set so that one point always faced up when it hit the ground. Roman writers call it the tribulus, which fits its look because it resembles a thorn. You toss a handful onto a path, and they settle into a nasty carpet that bites whatever steps across. A horse that plants a hoof on one can go lame in a second. A running man who hits one with a thin sole loses balance and becomes a problem for the people behind him. Legions used caltrops to shape movement before anyone traded blows. Scouts scattered them on likely approach routes to slow a cavalry dash. Engineers seated them near gaps in fieldworks to punish anyone who tried a flank. Commanders also threw them ahead of a planned withdrawal, since a light layer across a road could buy a unit the extra minute it needed to reset the line. The tool worked because it forced a choice. Either the enemy slowed down and picked a careful path, or they kept pace and risked chaos. Both outcomes helped the Romans, who were trained to exploit small hesitations with a quick push. The geometry made them reliable. With 4 points set in a tetrahedron pattern, at least one spike always stood ready. Most were hand-sized and made of iron, so they were tough, cheap, and easy to make in bulk. Smiths could bend and weld them by the crate, which mattered because you needed coverage to be effective. Soldiers carried them in sacks or leather pouches and tossed them in a loose spread, not in neat rows. That random layout made them hard to spot until it was too late. There were counters, but they cost time. Crews could rake a lane or lay down brush mats, yet that meant pausing under missile fire from slingers, archers, or small engines. Infantry with hobnailed sandals sometimes got lucky, and the nailheads took the hit, but enough found skin that units learned to respect any suspicious ground. The Caltrop was not dramatic, and it did not win a battle on its own. It created fractures in momentum, and those small fractures gave disciplined troops the opening to decide the fight on their terms. Number 9. The Carroballista. Think of the Carroballista as a ballista that learned to move with the army. It was a torsion-powered bolt shooter mounted on a two-wheeled cart, drawn by mules and handled by a small trained crew. The frame held 2 twisted skeins that stored energy in cords of sinew or hair. When the winch drew the slider back and the trigger released, the arms snapped forward and launched a heavy iron-headed bolt along a straight guide. The cart gave this engine a new job on the battlefield. It no longer waited on a wall or in a fixed battery. It could roll with the column, unlimber fast, and start shaping the fight before hand-to-hand contact. Crews set the cart on firm ground, chocked the wheels, and used a screw or wedge to raise or lower the bed. A simple front sight and range markers helped them repeat shots. They worked in a rhythm that a centurion could plan around. Load, draw, check wind, fire, then shift a few paces to avoid counterfire. The bolts were long, stiff, and tipped for penetration. They could cut through shields and light armor, and they were devastating against close-packed infantry who thought they were still safe at mid-range. Against cavalry, a volley across the front rank could break a charge into uneven clumps that the legion would punish a moment later. Mobility changed tactics as much as power. Commanders put carroballisti on the flanks to rake oblique angles, or they parked them behind a cohort to cover a lane where enemy archers liked to work. On broken ground, the team used the cart to hop between small rises and keep a clear line of fire. The machine needed care to stay accurate. Crews covered the skeins when the weather turned damp, checked tension through the day, and kept the slider bed smooth with oil and scraping. Smiths traveled with spare heads and fittings. Carpenters carried pins, wedges, and a replacement tiller. That support kept the weapon steady through a long march. The carrobalista did more than kill from a distance. It created pressure that did not let up. An enemy line forced to dodge steady bolts starts to drift and compress. Officers hesitate to stand visible. Archers struggle to set their feet. Each small disruption makes the Roman advance easier and the final clash shorter. That is why the cart mattered. It turned precision fire into a tool that could appear where it was needed, work for a few deadly minutes, and then move before the other side could answer. Number 10. The Testudo formation, the human weapon. The Testudo was not magic or myth. It was a disciplined way to turn many bodies and many shields into one moving shape that shrugged off missiles and pressure. Picture a front rank locking big curved shields shoulder to shoulder, while the ranks behind lift their shields over the heads of the unit to make a tight roof. The sides fold in so there are no open edges. Gaps are the enemy, so each man reads the shield of his neighbor and adjusts until the rims overlap and the boss sits where it should. The command comes from a centurion, and the rhythm is set by a horn, because the formation only works when everyone moves in the same pulse. The shields are heavy and tall, so the steps are short and steady, and the men breathe through the slots under the rims. Arrows and javelins hit and skip off. Stones thump the roof and roll down the shell. The point is not speed. The point is to cross the danger zone without losing shape, then open at the right second, and let the front ranks go to work. The Testudo shines in sieges, where a unit needs to get close to a wall, set ladders, or protect sappers while they dig and pry. It also helps during street fighting, when rooftops and windows are alive with slingstones and darts. The formation is not perfect, and the Romans knew that. It struggles on broken ground where feet cannot find even purchase. It is vulnerable to flanking when space is wide, and the unit cannot see a fast threat coming around the shell. Heat builds under the roof, and strain builds in thighs and shoulders, so officers time the effort and rotate men to keep hands strong. Defenders try hooks to pull shields, pots of fire to scare the front, and heavy drops aimed at one spot to punch a dent in the roof. That is why the best units pair the formation with quick bursts forward and planned pauses behind mantlets or earthworks. The gear matters too. The curved scutum helps the overlap. Good grips let a soldier lock the angle without losing his wrist. Helmets with deep brow guards and neck plates take the surprise hits that sneak past the rim. Training ties it all together. Recruits practice on a drill field with weighted gear until closing ranks feels like a reflex and not a thought. They learn to raise and lower the roof on a signal, to shift left or right without tearing the shell, and to clear missiles from the top with a quick sweep. Modern riot lines use the same logic with shields that lock and roofs that fold up under threat. That echo tells you why the Testudo earned its reputation. It turned confusion into order and turned a rain of missiles into noise the Legion could ignore while it set up the real blow.